Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome all the students and other members of the Yeshiva University community to what promises to be an extraordinary evening. The next great conversation hosted by the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought. A special welcome to Moshe Strauss, who with Zahava are my partners in this extraordinary endeavor. I want to thank President Joel for all his encouragement. He can't be with us tonight, as just last night he celebrated the wedding of his son. And Mazel Tov to President Joel, and a thank you as always to the Strauss Center's Assistant Director for Operations, Dr. Stuart Halpern, to whom we wish a Mazel Tov after just yesterday successfully defending his doctoral dissertation. Yes. Mazel Tov, Stuart. In introducing our very distinguished guest today, I'll begin by citing one of his own many books that I've enjoyed reading, in which he reports that when he first began attending Yale Law School, he glowingly reported home to his mother in Borough Park the names of the brilliant professors whose lectures he was attending. All their names: Goldstein, Pollack, Pickel, Skolnick, Schwartz. Then he writes, I told my mother about the most brilliant of my teachers, Calabrese. Without missing a beat, my mother asked, oh, is he an Italian Jew? Angrily, says our guest, he said to his mother, don't be so parochial. He's an Italian Catholic. Not all smart people have to have Jewish blood. Several months later, he writes, I learned that Guido Calabrese was in fact descended from Italian Jews. You never told your mother, right? Is that right?
I wrote about it
in the book, yeah.
Test her to see whether she got
to that page, right? Exactly. It's a good test. Here at the Strauss Center this evening, we are delighted to welcome someone who we are proud to say embodies brilliant Jewish achievements in the law, Professor Alan Dershowitz. He is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard University and without question one of the most famous figures in the legal world today. He has throughout his career shown that one can embody Jewish pride without parochialism, championing civil liberties and human rights for all while at the same time stepping forward as one of the most prominent defenders of Jews in the Jewish state. Always, but especially given what is going on in the Middle East right now, we are so glad to welcome a man that has rightly been called Israel's lead attorney in the court of public opinion. We're honored by his presence as the Strauss Center oversees seminars this academic year related to Jewish and Western philosophies of law, as well as the subject of law and national security. Building on this center's calling to bridge Torah and Western thought, our topic today joins Bible and the legal world in a dialogue entitled From Sodom to Nuremberg, a conversation about Genesis, justice, and the law. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dershowitz.
Can I just respond to you?
Of course, absolutely. You get full response rights.
Lovely introduction. First of all, I feel like I've come home. I tried very, very hard to be a student at Yeshiva University, but in their wisdom, and it was the right decision, the admissions committee turned me down. In fact, I'm told there had been no admissions committee until I was turned down. I formed the admissions committee. Rabbi Zuroff got on the train from Brooklyn. I came all the way up to speak to the president of Yeshiva University, at the time Dr. Belkin, and urged him, please, you don't have to go through what I went through with that bandit. And so I was turned down, but here I look out and I see all of who would have been my classmates at Yeshiva, and some of my oldest friends from Camp Maple Lake, friends from Camp Eton, friends from Yeshiva Eitz Chaim. So I'm so thrilled that you invited me here. It's a nostalgic trip for me and really a return home. So thank you very much.
If you're interested in reapplying, I know him. Actually, HaKadosh Baruch Hu might not want you to reapply.
My daughter, who's now 22, was born the next day. We got a letter from Norman Lamb saying we don't want to make the same mistake twice. Enclosed was a certificate of admission.
Okay, let's start with Sodom.
Right.
Many of my conversations begin that way. Let's start with Sodom. So, God is about to destroy an utterly evil city-state and decides to engage Avram in a discussion about his plans. In Avram's response, we see several remarkable features. First, a willingness to challenge, in this case, challenge the decree of God. Second, he expresses a belief in his ability to discern a standard of justice to which even he can call into based on which he can even call into question decisions of the shofet kol haaretz.
Right.
And third, he puts forward the notion that even 10 innocent people should cause God to spare the city. You drew on this last point in an essay for the Wall Street Journal last year, in an op-ed entitled, it was on the Casey Anthony case, it was entitled "The System Worked," and you wrote, "For thousands of years, Western society has insisted that it's better for 10 guilty defendants to go free than for one." It finds its roots in the biblical story of Abraham's argument with God about the sinners of Sodom. Abraham admonishes God for planning to sweep away the innocent along with the guilty. God agrees and reassures Abraham that he would spare the city if there were 10 righteous. From this compelling account, you wrote, the legal standard has emerged. So in other words, Avram is emerging as what you would call the first criminal defense attorney.
Right.
Now, of course, Avram loses, though, in the end, because in the end he does not save Sodom. You have a better winning record than the first Jewish defense attorney. And he never plays his trump card, which is to mention that there is at least one righteous person in Sodom who does not deserve to die, which is his nephew Lot. So let's begin with that. As a teacher of law and as a criminal defense attorney, what does the story tell you about the nature of justice in Avram's time and today?
The story has always been very important for me, and partly because of one other word that comes before Hashofet, and that is Chalila Lacha. I mean, imagine if I ever said Chalila to my grandmother, she'd smack me in the face. You know, the King James Version of Chalila is far be it from thee, but obviously if you know the Hebrew root of Chalila, Chalel, it's a much stronger word than that. And it's a very, in many ways, inappropriate word for a human being to address to God. It expresses how strongly he felt about that and how strongly he felt about being to take on God. Now, of course, God invited him. Unlike in the next chapter where God commands him to take his son, his only son, the one he loves, there's no argument back because God does not invite dialogue. And Abraham understood the difference between invited dialogue and uninvited dialogue. I actually once asked President Clinton over dinner how he understood the difference between the two stories of the two Abrahams, the compliant one and the argumentative one. He said, it's very simple. When I'm the president and I want argument from my cabinet members, I invite it. But when, as president, I tell my cabinet members, do this, I don't expect any talk back. And so he understood it very, very clearly. Of course, the substance of the story is fascinating because God, as God, could have figured out who was innocent and who was guilty. And I think what he was doing was teaching Abraham about the difference between divine justice and human justice. Human justice, by its nature, is always going to be fallible. There are always going to be mistakes. But he was really saying to him, Abraham and God, in the dialogue, how important it is to err on the side of convicting only the guilty, never, ever convicting the innocent. But the other message is you can't expect perfection. If there are 50, 40, 30 innocent people on death row, you don't only save those people, you abolish the death penalty. Because a system which allows so many innocent people to be convicted, there must be something deeply wrong with the human system. But if there are 5 or 6 or 7, maybe innocent people out of thousands and thousands, if you demand absolute perfection, the system of human justice will never be allowed to go forward. And the difference between Jewish justice and Catholic justice is, I think, reflected in this view. Catholic justice, it is the worst sin in the world to ever even think about punishing one innocent person or one innocent fetus. Of course, our Talmud teaches us the same thing. He who saves one human being, it's as if they saved the entire world. But the Catholic system of justice can't tolerate any kind of ambiguity. It's also reflected in the great argument between Dmitri and his brother and the brothers Karamazov where the brother, where Dmitri or Ivan says to the brother, what if we could save all of humankind, perfect all of humankind by simply killing that one baby who's crying on the shoulder of the mother? And the deeply religious person, Alyosha, the brother, says, no, we wouldn't do it. Let humankind suffer. Whereas the pragmatist, the utilitarian, says, well, one human being to save the whole world, maybe it's permissible. And of course, this is all being acted out today as we speak in Gaza. The Israeli army, which according to Richard Kemp, the former commander of British troops in Afghanistan, is the most moral army in the history of warfare, tries desperately to avoid even a single human casualty, but it can't. It knows that in order to save possibly hundreds of Israeli civilians, it may have to kill several innocent Palestinians after warning them, after giving them an opportunity to leave, after dropping leaflets, after denying Palestinians the right to use human shields. So Jewish justice and Israeli justice, which aren't always the same, understand proportionality. And I think the world has come to accept that. The world has come to accept Abraham's argument about proportionality, saying justice can never be absolute. But as long as it's proportional, as long as we accept the rule, better 10 guilty go free than 1 innocent be wrongly convicted, we can operate a just standard of human accountability. And I think, for me, that's the message of Sodom.
And how does this, I want to get to Israel in a moment too, but how does this then figure into your own motivation when you represent people who you know are not definitely guilty, but probably guilty?
Well, I've represented 36 people in my career who have been charged with homicide or attempted homicide. And I've managed to win for over 30 of them. Now, most of them probably were guilty. After all, we live in a society where the vast majority of people charged with crime are guilty. Thank God for that. Would anybody want to live in a society where the majority of people charged with crime are innocent? That might be Iran, that might be China, that might be Syria. It's not the United States, and it's not Israel. My job is to keep it that way. How do I keep it that way? By fighting as hard as I can for every single client, whether innocent or guilty. Now, I know statistically most of my clients are probably guilty, but I don't know which ones are guilty. They all tell me they're innocent. They all swear on their mother's graves that they're innocent, but if they're willing to kill, they're willing to lie. And they all think that I will do a better job for them if they persuade me that they're innocent. But I also remember that Abraham was arguing on behalf of the guilty. Remember, Abraham didn't say, if there are 30 innocent people, spare the 30 innocent people. He said, if there are 30 innocent people, spare the entire city. So he was arguing on behalf of the guilty as well. God could easily have responded by saying, Abraham, if there are 20 innocent people, I'll spare the 20 innocent people. But again, he was trying to teach Abraham about human justice. Abraham was going to be the leader of great people who would be trying to bring justice to the world. And so when you think of the role of a defense attorney, it's to keep the system just. And the way to keep the system just is to defend people guilty and innocent. Let me just switch it. You're a rabbi. Imagine for a moment...
I represent very few murderers.
No? Well, but imagine for a moment, instead of being a rabbi, you were a Catholic priest. And imagine...
I'm there with you.
Okay. You're wearing the black. Imagine somebody comes to you in confession. The reason I use the Catholic priest is the Jewish rules of confessional aren't as firm as the Catholic rules. But somebody comes to a Catholic priest and says, I have murdered my boss, my wife, my friend, my child. And the priest says, oh my God, you have to confess. You will go to purgatory if you don't confess. And the man says, fine, but I don't want you to tell on me. The priest can't tell. The priest can't disclose that. In the Catholic Church, it's so tough that even if a person comes in during the confessional, and while in the confessional says, I am a serial killer. I've killed 7 people and I'm going to do it again. After the Catholic priest pleads with him not to do it again and to turn him in, he cannot drop a dime on that person. Now, is that priest acting immorally, or is he accepting role morality? His job is not to save lives, it's to save souls. My job is not to produce justice in a particular case. It's to help the overall system of justice. And I'm sure, although you don't defend murderers, you have had, you're very young, if you haven't yet, you will have situations where people will tell you in confidence things that as a human being you will want to reveal, but as a rabbi you can't.
So it sounds like then, to take the parallel, when you're defending someone who you don't know for sure, but you think might be guilty, it sounds like actually your motivations are at least motivated by a profoundly Jewish ethic then, you think. But let me give you one quote that was very interesting, one that you wrote in your book, Letters to a Young Lawyer. I wanted your reflection on this. Here's what you said. You said, when you're a lawyer working for a client, you're neither liberal nor conservative,
right,
black or white, man or woman, Jew or Christian. You are whatever it is in the legitimate best interest of your client.
Right.
So does that mean that here, it sounds like you're saying here that, no, actually, you think that playing the role that you do can be a legitimate Jewish expression of keeping the innocent safe?
Yes,
yeah.
But while doing it, I might be disserving more immediate Jewish interests. For example, when I defended O.J. Simpson, which my mother called the Oy O.J. phase of my career, one of the men who he was accused of killing, of course, was a Jewish man named John Goldman. And I got many nasty letters from people saying, how dare you take the side of a black man against a Jew? I don't think about that. I don't think of who the victim is. I don't think about who the alleged killer is. When I'm making the decision to represent somebody, I don't have to represent O.J. Simpson. Why did I? I had actually gone on television the day after he was arrested on the Katie Couric Today Show and said, of course he's guilty. Look at the evidence. He was the spouse, he was the husband, he had previously abused her. In 90% of cases where there is a murder by a former wife, it's done by the former husband. You can get it up to 95% when you talk about prior spousal abuse. And then about a week later, I got a call from Bob Shapiro saying, we need you to represent O.J. Simpson because he's facing the death penalty and you never turn down death penalty cases. And I said, well, you can't use me. Look at what I said on television. I said he was almost certainly guilty. And Shapiro said, well, of course, everybody thinks he's almost certainly guilty. The evidence seems overwhelming, but we need you to save his life from the death penalty. And I can explain to you in 60 seconds how come we won that case, by the way. It's really fascinating how come we won that case. We didn't win because we were such good lawyers. We won largely because they were very bad lawyers, and the police did something terrible. So the major piece of evidence they had was a sock that they said they found in front of O.J. Simpson's bed, which had on it the blood of O.J. Simpson plus the blood of both of his victims. You couldn't manufacture a better piece of evidence, and that's in fact what they did. We were able to prove that in 3 ways. Number one, they didn't know when they said the sock was in front of O.J. Simpson's bed that a videographer had come in and taken pictures of the apartment before the police conducted their search, and there was no picture of any black sock on the white rug. Second of all, they claimed that the sock was sprinkled with blood. Let me stand up for a second and show you this. With one hand, al regel achad. So it would have been sprinkled in this way. The blood sprinkled on the sock. Okay. Then you would have the blood on the outer sock, outer part of the sock, and then you'd have a mirror image of the blood on the inner part of the sock. But you wouldn't have a mirror image on the third or the fourth part of the sock, right? What happened was we looked at the sock, we examined it under a microscope, and found that all 4 sides of the socks had mirror image blood splatter. If any of you watch Dexter, you know what blood spatter is. And that proved conclusively that the sock had been laid down flat and blood had been poured on it. We then investigated the blood and found out that it had in it EDTA, which is a chemical that is found only in lab samples, but not in the human body. The human body doesn't have EDTA. EDTA is added to tubes of blood in order to prevent them from coagulating. So the police had taken blood, Officer Van Adder, had taken blood that was in the test tubes of all 3 of the participants and had simply poured them on the sock in order to frame a guilty person. He honestly believed that O.J. Simpson did it and that he would get away with it because the blood on the glove would be suppressed as an illegal search. So he tried to create a new piece of evidence, and we caught him. And as a result of that, most of the jurors said that they could not vote to convict a person if they believed that the police planted evidence against him, even if he was guilty. So, question to you. If you were the jurors and you thought the evidence proved him guilty, but also thought it proved the police had planted evidence against him, how many of you vote to convict? How many of you vote to acquit? That's a hung jury. You know, in that case, the process of justice demanded one result, and perhaps the ends of justice demanded a different result. And if you believe 10 guilty should go free rather than one innocent wrongly convicted, maybe the result is not as difficult to understand as the media has portrayed.
It's a very interesting episode of Law and Order Washington Heights. That's fascinating. Let's now, given the seriousness of what's going on in the Middle East, let's go back to your very important point about Israel and civilian casualties. I want to build on what you said about the story with Avram Avinu, sort of further that shot that you were putting forward. Here I'm drawing on Mefarshim, traditional Mefarshim, but also Liam Cass's excellent book on Genesis.
Right.
And he says like this, basically the approach would be like this. Avram has been applying justice his entire life as an individual. He's an individual person, he lives in the desert, etc., etc. But God stresses, he stresses before, why does he need to talk to him beforehand? Because he says, Avram Avram's going to be a nation.
Right.
So he needs to understand what I'm doing here. God is engaging in statecraft. He's punishing the city, which is really a city-state. We think it's a city, but it's actually a state.
Right.
Okay. So, Avram's justice is on a personal level with individuals. But God here is telling him, and telling us, reading the Torah, that punishing a society for its embrace of evil involves maybe a different approach. And maybe that's why, as you said, Avram stops at 10, because he understands. Right?
That's a kahal.
He has to learn a lesson.
Right.
Even if that innocent person, by the way, is his nephew. Right. He doesn't even mention. And what's so interesting is, we don't even see God telling Avram that he's saving Lot. We don't see that. Mm-hmm. We know the angels go out and see it. But for all Avram knows, Lot is dead. He doesn't know.
Right.
So you've noted again and again that Israel goes out of its way, and you've defended Israel in a court of public opinion on this.
Right.
It goes out of its way more than any other state. Higher ratio, I would bet, than the U.S. and Afghanistan.
Much better ratio.
Right, with, to prevent civilian casualties.
Right.
And they do that, as we saw in Jenin and other places, at great expense sometimes to their own soldiers' lives.
Right.
And again, it doesn't seem to help them at all, whatever they do here in the court of public opinion for doing this. So my question is, are they focusing too much on the Abrahamic individual focus on justice, pre the lesson that God teaches him? And maybe their obligation is to focus more on just all-out war on an evil society.
Sure, and that argument can be made. It was, of course, made in defense of the United States' decision to drop at least the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And Truman, in his memoirs, makes that argument about statecraft. He said, if we had to invade the home islands of Japan, we would have lost 100,000 American troops in the process, and better to kill 100,000 or more innocent civilians in Japan than to take the lives of 100,000 young American innocents, even though they were in uniforms. They were your children, my children, they were 18-year-old kids. And that argument was made and mostly accepted by international law and international public opinion. And I think the Cass analysis is brilliant. I wish I had thought of it in time for my book, Genesis of Justice. If I redo a second edition, I would certainly, with attribution, include that argument. I think it's excellent. I do think individual justice in the end is very important and must be carried forward. That is, you can say state justice, state-to-state justice, but in the end, even there, you have to do justice. There has to be some sense of proportionality. You can't just wipe out a society. Today, you may have heard that Prime Minister Sharon's son made a god-awful statement. I knew General Sharon, I knew Prime Minister Sharon, and he actually spoke to me shortly after the decision to end the occupation of Gaza. He would not have approved of what his son said. His son, in an article in the Jerusalem Post, talked about leveling, talked about doing what we did in Hiroshima to Gaza. The Israeli public wouldn't accept that. The Israeli public would never agree to that. When some years ago, the Israelis bombed the worst terrorist in Israel, a guy who was planning to blow up Ashdod, and they killed him, but they also killed 14 innocent civilians who lived in the adjoining building. The public reaction in Israel by Israeli citizens was outrage. Don't do that. Swastikas were painted on the cars of Air Force pilots who had participated in that raid, even though it was a complete accident. So Israel, the Israeli people, demand proportionality even more than public opinion does. And I think Israel should do the right thing. It should satisfy its own people. It should act in the tradition of the Jewish people and shouldn't care as much as it does about public opinion. Because you remember that old ad? There was an ad that used to be on television. This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs. I've always believed this is your brain. This is among my colleagues at Harvard. This is your brain when it comes to ordinary things. Pretty smart people, my colleagues. This is your brain on Jews. When you start thinking about Jews and Israel and the Jewish state, somehow the brain gets scrambled. Somehow a double standard is applied. Things that are never demanded of other people are demanded of us. We simply can never satisfy them. We have to satisfy ourselves.
So then the question is whether, I mean, is this something, this notion of applying justice to a society?
It's a good point.
Yeah, so is that something we've lost? I don't just mean we, meaning the notion of international law. When you go back to Sodom, I remember when I was in Cheder, they would teach you all these midrashim about Sodom, about, describes how they made laws against morality. It was illegal to be moral in Sodom. And as a kid, you accept these midrashim, very literal, and you say that. And then when you get older, you think, a little older, you think, well, come on, no society can be like that. And then you get a little older even more, and you think, no, there are societies like that.
Gaza is like
that.
that.
Yeah, it is like that, where there are other evil societies, and Nazi Germany was like that, and there were other totalitarian societies that were like that.
And I think we didn't do justice after the Second World War. After the Second World War, we punished several hundred Nazis. It's as if space aliens,
that's Nuremberg,
right, had come down from outer space and gotten into the bodies of good Germans who had written, Beethoven and listened to beautiful music. And suddenly, those several hundred people turned the German people into people who could bring a Holocaust. We now know from Goldhagen and others that millions and millions of Germans were complicit in the Holocaust, as well as millions, or at least hundreds of thousands of Poles and Ukrainians and others. And we let the German nation get away with it. At the end of the Second World War, we looked forward instead of looking both forward and backward. We introduced the Marshall Plan. Hitler had promised the German people in 1932, if you kill the Jews, Germany will be the wealthiest country in Europe. And they killed the Jews, and Germany became the wealthiest country in Europe as the result of the Marshall Plan. Secretary of the Treasury, Morgenthau, had a different plan in mind. He wanted to punish all of the German people for 50 years, for a generation or two, by making sure that they lived a subsistence level, not a starvation level, but an agrarian subsistence level. Their concert halls would be closed, their amusement parks would be shut down, no dessert. When you think about it, it's a trivial punishment for the destruction of a whole civilization. Never before in history has an entire civilization been destroyed in such a brief period of time. But Eastern European Yiddish culture was a civilization. It was a civilization as grand as Rome, as grand as Greece, as much of a contribution to the world as any culture in history, and it was completely destroyed. On its ashes was built another culture, a unique culture in the world, namely the culture of Israeli Jews. Obviously, Zionism begins before the Holocaust, and its roots go way, way back in history, but nonetheless, you see one culture emerging on the ashes of another culture, and yet the German people didn't pay a high enough price. Germany today is one of the most successful countries in the world. You might say that shows the success of the Marshall Plan. It rejected communism, it accepted the Western way, but at an enormous cost to morality. The message that was sent after Nuremberg was, you can't get away with single murder, you can't get away with murdering 5 people, but if you murder 6 million, 20 people, 20 million, 50 million people, you can get away with it. That message was not lost on Pol Pot, the dictator of Cambodia. That message was not lost on the people who brought us the genocides in Rwanda and Darfur. And the 20th century was the century of genocide. And it was the century of genocide in part because the lesson of the Second World War was, if you have to look to the future will have more weight. The United States took in German scientists like Werner von Braun, and he helped send people to the moon. But at what cost in our morality? At what point did we err too much on the side of excusing and justifying and looking to the future rather than imposing on the German people who voted for Hitler? They voted for him not with a majority but a plurality in 1932, but in 36, had there been a real election, they would have voted for him overwhelmingly. He was very, very popular. And when people vote for leaders, as the Palestinian people voted for Hamas leaders, they have to bear some of the responsibility for their vote.
So let's move from still, let's build on the Avram story, you mentioned this before, to the Akedah, which, as you said, seems to be the opposite case. No challenge to God, obedience. And I want to ask, just maybe let's reflect a bit about what are the implications of that story when paired with the stone story for the power of the human mind to discern certain standards of justice. The Rav of Soloveitchik Zatzal has a story that when he was a kid, he would learn, he learned Gemara with his father. And they learned everything together. But at one point he asked his father, he said, why is it sometimes that the Gemara leaves certain things unresolved? And sometimes they end in tekel. Here you have a corpus of law, which is on the one hand a testament to the brilliance of a people. Surely one of the most intellectually impressive works in the history of civilization at the time. And yet they end off questions with a tekel. So why do they do that? All the time. There must be hundreds of tekus in the Gemara. So the Rav's father answers is to communicate a lesson. He said, the Jew has to know that there are things that he does not know. And the point, in other words, that Judaism, there seems to be, this is the point that Rav Soloveitchik was trying to make, and in an essay that we read in our philosophy of law class called Majesty and Humility, the Rav later propounded on that. He said that in Judaism there's a constant tension, in other words. First, an awareness of the extraordinary ability of the human mind, but also of its simultaneous limitations and of the humbling of that mind before the omniscience of God. And this tension is throughout our tradition. We have both chok and mishpat, things which are understandable and those which are not. And perhaps that seems to me that's the message of the Akedah, because this is the test for precisely this person who's willing to challenge Avram. It's a perfect test, to see if he's willing to humble himself. And so my question is this something, Rav Soloveitchik says this is something that modern man has lost. The humility of the human mind. And would you agree, and do you find this missing from the human endeavor of law today?
Absolutely. On the way in, my old friend Carl Meschberger and I spent the entire trip talking exactly about that. It's as if we were preparing for your answer. And I was talking about the arrogance of science and sometimes the arrogance of epistemology, that somehow we think we're smart enough to figure everything out. I remember as a kid, 7 years old, reading the Adon Olam and saying, I don't understand B'terem Kol. I don't understand what it means before all. I don't understand Acharei Kichlot HaKol. I don't understand those words. They have no meaning for me. How can there be something before anything? How can there be something after everything? And I always thought those words were also intended to suggest the limitations of human knowledge. Newton's dog didn't understand a great deal, and Newton was only 100 times smarter than Newton's dog. Why do we think we have the capacity to understand everything? We don't. Science does not have the capacity to explain everything. I have a lot of friends who are among the most arrogant physicists that you can imagine. They think they're going to get to the secret of it all. They're not going to. That's the secret. The secret is you'll never, ever understand everything. You'll never understand everything in religion. You'll never understand everything in science. You'll never understand everything in law. For me, the word truth is not a noun, it's a verb. Like in truthing, it's a process. We try hard to get at something that we hope is close to the truth, but we never get there. And for me, the best answer to the Akedah actually is the one you've suggested: incomprehensibility. I do not understand how a God could ask a human being to do what God asked Abraham to do. I do not understand how Abraham could accept that order. I do not understand the denouement of the story completely, and I'm left with teku. I'm left with a conflict. But the brilliance of the Talmud is not so much that it ends arguments with teku, is that it is the first religious text, and maybe the only religious text in history, that preserves dissenting opinions. In other cultures, dissenters were burned. Dissenters were killed. In Judaism, dissenters are praised. The notion is, who knows, someday, maybe, we will learn something that will make that dissenting opinion a majority opinion. I think it's no accident that the great dissenters in Supreme Court history have been Brandeis, Cardozo, Frankfurter. It's not an accident. And I think they all had this sense that maybe someday, and in Brandeis's case, that came true. His view of freedom of speech, which was almost always a dissenting view, became the majority view. I remember when I was the law clerk for Justice Goldberg, telling him that story, because at one point he didn't want to write a dissenting opinion. He said it will upset the Chief Justice. And I said, no, you have an obligation. If you think that this is the correct view of law, you have an obligation to my children, your grandchildren, to put that point of view out there. And he did. It was a strange point of view about the Ninth Amendment and how the Ninth Amendment was really more important than other scholars had thought it was. And then, believe it or not, a generation later, one of his law clerks gets put on the Supreme Court, Steve Breyer, and he starts writing about the Ninth Amendment. And maybe when Steve Breyer's grandchildren are appointed to the Supreme Court, eventually that view will prevail. Jews have a long time frame, and the Talmud suggests a long intellectual time frame.
It's actually a good plug for my idea to form a college organization called Shammai to compete with the Hill organization. People will come and ask, about Judaism, we'll chase them out with a stick. It'd be difficult fundraising.
Well, I would become a faculty advisor for that, because at Harvard, I'm the faculty advisor to Chabad, to Hillel, and to the Jewish Humanist Society. So I would be happy.
Not at the same time.
Both at the same time, and I try to bring them together, and may 1,000 menorahs be lit.
Okay. So would you agree that, it seems to me that that is really what makes the American notion of rights. I always thought the American notion of rights is one that unites both the power of reason and the power of faith.
I don't think there is an American notion of rights, any more than I think there is a Jewish notion of rights. I think both Americanism and Judaism are so multifaceted. They contain, I've always disagreed with the word halakha. I really think the word ought to be done in a plural. There is, I don't believe, one narrow road anywhere that leads anywhere. I just think there are roads with variations. And when I hear about the American approach to law, is that Clarence Thomas? Is that...
he is writing dissents, we'll say.
Right. Yes, maybe it will be. Is it William Brennan? There's no singular American approach to law. And when I hear about the Jewish approach to law, is it Harav Soloveitchik? Or is it some Haredi? Yes. It's easy. But is it Harav Soloveitchik Sr. or Harav Soloveitchik Jr.? Who knows? We may see some different variations over time.
But the Declaration and the Constitution together do embody a unique vision. You don't think so? That is, on the one hand, both embraces the power of discerning self-evident truths while still bringing God and the mystery of faith into the equation.
But do you remember that, as you know, you're a scholar of Jefferson, I've written books about Jefferson as well, Jefferson's views of God very close to Spinoza's views. In fact, they found a copy of Spinoza's great book in Jefferson's library. And his conception of God was very different from the common Christian conception of God prevalent at the time. He was a deist. He believed in God as the original clockmaker, but not an intervening God. Yet in the Declaration of Independence, providence is thanked and natural law is mentioned. But it's so interesting. The Declaration mentions God, God's law, and the law of nature over and over again. The Constitution, written only a decade later, a decade and a half later, never mentions God. Mentions religion only twice, and both in negative ways. Nor shall any religious test be required, nor shall any religious be established. Why? Well, very obviously, when you're a revolutionary and you don't have the law, the positive law on your side, you need natural law. You need God's law. You need to have a justification for overthrowing positive law. The best way to turn somebody from a revolutionary into a conservative is to have them win the revolution. And so Jefferson and Madison win the revolution with Adams and others, and they write a constitution that says, no, 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 no. You can't start invoking God and natural law. We won. We write the laws now. You have to obey our laws. And that's the way you see the shift from, so which is the American way? The Declaration of Independence or the godless Constitution? That debate has been raging since the beginning of the 19th century.
Actually, and just an additional point to that, all the providential references to God in the Declaration were not Jefferson's. They were those were the Frum editions that were added in afterwards by all the people I really like.
But you know, if you take that argument, then I can respond also by saying that the last part of Kohelet, people have argued also may have been put in by John Adams, or the John Adams comparable figures, because when you read the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, it is such a difficult and troubling book, and in ways that so challenge religion, and so challenge theodicy, and so challenge so many principles, and then you come to the denouement, the end, which seems to suggest a somewhat different message. So, you know, it again makes my point. There is no singular way. When you look at the great documents of history, you see various kinds of input into the documents and different interpretations over the generations.
I want to, before we turn over to the students for one or two questions, I wanted to ask one final thing. Just one of the things in which is, I think, as I said to you personally, you play such an important role for both America and Klal Yisrael, is that you're not just one of the foremost defenders of Israel, but you're one of the foremost defenders of Israel now on the liberal part of the spectrum. You know, I had the opportunity to give a prayer at the Republican National Convention.
I watched you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. But what struck me afterwards, people kept coming over to me, God bless you, God bless Israel. I mean, that was to me the most moving moment for me. And then, so a week later, when they tried to ram Jerusalem back into the platform, right, and we saw booing for the mention of Jerusalem. Now, we both agree that it's important for there to be pro-Israel voices on both sides of the political spectrum. So my question to you is, you're at Harvard. Where is the next generation going on the left? And
I'm very worried about that. I'm very worried. First of all, I was thrilled that you gave one of the benedictions to the Republican Party. I think it's very important that Jews and pro-Israel supporters be represented on both parties, by both parties, that Israel never become a wedge issue that divides Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, the way it has in Europe. And certainly I'm the first one to tell you, I would say acknowledge, but I don't acknowledge it, that sounds defensive, to tell you that we have a real problem within the Democratic Party. One of the reasons I'm remaining within the Democratic Party is to fight against that problem, to fight against the people who booed when the Jerusalem matter was put back in the platform. By the way, I was involved in the process of getting the Jerusalem matter put in the platform. I have access to the White House and to the President's ear. He's called on me on several occasions for advice about Iran, and I take advantage of that access in order to make sure that my vote is not something that is earned easily. My vote has to be earned every day, all the time. And even most recently, when it came to the President making statements about Gaza, I called the White House immediately and got access to people I know who have access directly to the President to make sure that happens. 20 years ago, it was very important for Jewish Republicans to force Pat Buchanan out of the Republican Party because he was a virulent anti-Semite, a virulent anti-Zionist, and a terrible, terrible human being. And he was a Republican, along with some others, James Baker, others. There are bad guys in the Republican Party. There are a lot of bad guys in the Democratic Party. And it's important that we fight that struggle internally. I do it in the United States. My dear friend Erwin Cutler does it in Canada. My other dear friend Anthony Julian does it in London. We try to do it all over. We have some success and some failures. It's a work in progress. I did get condemned a lot for my support of the Democrats, and that will, I'm sure, continue. But I think it's very important that whoever wins the election have people who they think helped him win the election on the pro-Israel side. We can't let the enemies of Israel take over the Democratic Party. It's too important. The Democrats will continue to win elections, and it's very important, looking at young people here from Barnard and other places, and many of you from Yeshiva University, it's very important to fight that fight in your generation, to create Facebook, to create Twitter, to create friends of this and that, and make sure you can make the case for Israel based on principles that are acceptable to young people. You can't make old people's arguments to young people. And you have to make arguments that are amenable to them. And we try to do that, and it's a work in progress, and it's a worry. It's a big worry. When only 40% of Democrats support what Israel is doing today in Gaza, whereas 80-something% of Republicans do, it's a challenge. It's a worry. I want to raise that number in the Democratic Party. That's why right from here I'm going to CNN to speak on the Piers Morgan show again and to make the liberal, progressive case for Israel. By the way, many people think of me as a conservative now, even though my whole life has been a life of liberalism on the left. But because I support Israel, I must be a conservative. I must be a neocon. I must be a supporter of the extreme right wing. I must be this or that. There is no understanding that I support Israel, not despite my being a liberal, but because I'm a liberal. Because I support the values that Israel represents, not only in the way it governs, but in the way it fights wars. And I'm proud of my support for Israel, and I'm proud of my liberalism. That's it for one of the students. So
Thank you. First, thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.
It was enlightening. It was very interesting. I wanted to go back, actually, for a minute to the discussion of justice, and specifically of human justice, and ask really two questions that I think are very much related. The first is on sort of the limits of justice, and I'm curious if, in your mind, there was almost pre-programmed into an idea of human justice this leeway that certain things are going to fall by the wayside and are going to almost be left undeclared. And the question related to the sort of practical matter is, how far does that extend? Meaning, is there a clearly defined boundary between you killed one person, but you're very skilled at building military equipment, and so we will let you off and let you come, or you killed a million people?
No, I think there is no clear line. I think justice is a process. I wrote a book called Rights from Wrongs, in which my thesis was rights don't come from nature, they come from experience. They come from seeing that things are wrong. When we saw slavery was wrong, we enacted the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. When we saw that sexism was wrong, we enacted rules that gave equal rights to women. When we saw that genocide was wrong, after the Second World War, we created rules prohibiting genocide. And everything is always going to be a matter of degree. The Talmud tells a story that is also very, very difficult to understand. A walled city, and the evil Romans are calling to produce a one person, and the Talmud says if they name the person, he can be produced, and if they don't. Now, this became a real issue during the Second World War, obviously, when the Nazis would surround a ghetto and say, produce so-and-so. And the debates that went on within the authority. One of the great books was written by Rabbi Oshry. Many of you know it, Sheilot Tshuvot, From the Holocaust. It's a brilliant book. It should be required reading for every law student and every moralist. Writing these Sheilot Tshuvot, these Tshuvot to very difficult Sheilot during the Shoah is so remarkable. And you see, everything's a matter of degree. And that's very much the Jewish way.
One more student.
Hi, there are a number of places in the halacha which discuss the role of a judge in adjudicating a case, whether or not it's to reach justice or compromise. How do you look at that from a...
Well, I think there are different, first of all, the Torah doesn't say tzedek tirdof, it says tzedek tirdof. And obviously, it implies that there's more than one way of achieving justice. One way is rigorous adherence to the rule of law. The other may be to engage in an element of compassion or compromise. And it says tirdof. It doesn't say you should simply have justice. It says you're going to never get it. You're going to have to run after it. You're going to chase it. It'll never be achieved. It's always going to be a work in progress. And I have that sign on my office door. It's really been the symbol of my life in many ways, both the double tzedek and second, the tirdof. And I don't think there's a single answer to that. Sometimes judges have to compromise. Sometimes they have to apply the law rigorously.
Before Professor Dershowitz goes off to CNN to defend the show once again, please join me in thanking Professor.
Thank you.
For getting us off to a great start this year. Next Friday, a week from this Friday, our next great conversation on immersion defendants with Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. Please join us then.